The Healthcare Labyrinth Podcast is back for another episode. Join Marc S. Ryan, a veteran health plan and health technology executive, as he explores the world of healthcare.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Healthcare Labyrinth Podcast. My name is Marc Ryan, and it's a pleasure to be hosting the podcast, and thanks to everyone who's listening in. We're going to start a two-part podcast here this week. First edition right now, you're listening to it, and then next week we'll have the second edition. And this is really about healthcare and election year 2024. This week we're going to be talking about the status of some polling and the status of the presidential election, the Senate elections, and the House. As you know, everything is really tight, whether it's the White House, the House, or the Senate usually. And we'll talk a little bit about who might control each of the three areas, the presidency, the House, and the Senate. And then we're going to talk a little later on in this podcast about the why I think healthcare could be a sleeper issue in these elections and why it's still important for candidates to pay attention to healthcare. In part two next week, I will be talking about what I call my modest proposal for healthcare reform. As we know, there's been gridlock on Capitol Hill on healthcare issues. There's a deep divide. Healthcare is very divisive on Capitol Hill. But I believe it would be in the best interest of both parties to come together and create some healthcare reform that will stabilize our overall system, reduce costs, improve quality, and there could be a win-win for the parties if they did that. Do I think that will happen? Perhaps not, but I never give up trying to espouse ways to get healthcare reform passed on Capitol Hill. So with that introduction of our two-part podcast series, we're going to start off with the first part again about what's going on in election 2024. And then in the second half, we'll talk a little bit about healthcare and some polling and why I believe it's a sleeper issue. So I have talked a little bit about healthcare in election 2024 in the past, but what I want to start out with is really sort of give you a feel for some of the polling. Again, healthcare has been displaced by other economic issues and immigration as the compelling election 24 issues of the day. But again, I've taken the position that healthcare could very well play a role in this year's election. Let's take a look first at, again, the presidency and the houses of Congress to show how the election is very, very close here. For reliable forecasts on elections, there's many great prognosticators out there, much better than me. I've participated in politics for many decades, and I've participated in polling and things like that. I understand it well, but there are far better experts than me out there. So I've turned to many of those experts and their websites and some of what they're tracking today. So you'll see a lot of that today in this podcast. The one most important site that I really always go to is called Real Clear Politics. It, to me, is very reliable and unbiased. I also like the fact that it uses polling averages from many different polling entities, Democrat, Republican, Independent, doesn't really matter, to determine the current prospects of various political contenders. So that could be in Senate races or in House races or even for the presidency. In addition, I would note that I have a very special connection to Real Clear Politics because its publishing arm, Real Clear Publishing, was one of the publishers of my book. So I tend to follow Real Clear Politics very, very closely. Again, most of you know my book is The Healthcare Labyrinth, which is also the name of this website, and it's available on healthcarelabyrinth.com if you're interested. So I went to Real Clear Politics for the presidential and the Senate races, and I looked at a few other sources for the House races. So let's get to the presidential race first and what we're really seeing right now in that race. So as we've seen back in the 2016 election where Trump beat Hillary Clinton, or in the 2020 election where President Biden beat uh, then incumbent President Trump, in 2024, we're seeing again a very, very razor thin election. So polls can change. I am actually recording this sometime in late May, so it probably won't air for about 2 weeks or so. But nonetheless, the polls are pretty close. So I will give you what the polls look like right now in the presidential race, and I'll sort of give you what's been happening, generally speaking, over the last several weeks and months in these polls. So it's important to remember that Donald Trump and Joe Biden are not in just a head-to-head race. There's basically a five-way race here. And let's talk about head-to-head first. So the latest Real Clear Politics poll average, I told you I really like this averaging, says that President Trump is up over President Biden about 1.1 percentage points. Now, that's well within the margin of error. So in essence, it's sort of a dead heat. But nonetheless, the latest poll average shows Trump up in a head-to-head race by about 1.1. And again, this number will go up or down periodically. But we've sort of seen pretty consistently over the last several weeks and months that Trump is averaging about, in round numbers, about 1 percentage point ahead of Joe Biden in the head-to-head race. Well, when we get into a five-way race where principally you have Trump, Biden, RFK Jr., who is a Democrat running as an independent, and two other candidates that will bring some votes in at the polls on election day, Trump is actually ahead by about 1.8 percentage points over Biden. So it's a signal that there are more votes being taken from Biden when you count the three other candidates in the race than from Trump. What's very interesting is that RFK Jr. tends to steal votes from both Trump and Biden, but the other two marginal candidates in that five-way race are stealing many more votes from President Biden. So again, head-to-head, Trump is up about 1.1 percentage points right now over Biden. In a five-way race, Trump is ahead of Biden by about 1.8. That five-way race is running right around 2 pretty consistently over the last several weeks and months or so. Now, we know that the popular vote really doesn't matter in the presidential race. We have the Electoral College. And in all but 2 states, all of the Electoral College votes go to the winner of the ballot in those states and in the District of Columbia in this case. So the District of Columbia has 3 electoral votes. There's a total of 538 electoral votes. The electoral votes are basically 2 per state for each senator, and then 1 for each member of the House of Representatives, which brings you to 435 for the states, and then 3 votes for the District of Columbia. So 538 total electoral votes. So somebody could actually lose the popular vote and yet win in the Electoral College. And this has happened on a few occasions in the past. And so it's important to remember that people do track a very close popular vote, and we just talked about that. But the Electoral College vote is really, in many ways, what matters in the presidential race. So what does the Electoral College map look like right now? Well, again, state polls are notoriously challenging because they can be a very small sample in many cases, and they're not taken as widely or as often as national ballots. But in this case, if you look at a fairly commanding lead states where the outcome is fairly well known or can be fairly well established. You have about 219 electoral college votes for former President Trump, and about 215 for the current president, Joe Biden. That is very, very close in terms of, states that look pretty solidly or clearly leaning in favor of one candidate or the other. 219 for Trump, 215 for Biden. That leaves about 104 toss-up votes. Now, most of those toss-ups are in about 7 states out there. And I'm just going to read you those 7 states really quickly: Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Nevada. And I'm going to go back to some polls in those states right now. Well, if you look at those top battleground states, those 7, President Trump across those 7 has about a 3.2 percentage point lead over Biden, 47.6 to 44.4. So the overall lead in those 7 top battleground states is pretty reasonable for Trump, although very close to that margin of error as well. So that would tend to say that President Trump will win many or most of those 104 toss-up electoral college votes out there. Let's look a little closer at the polls in those states, because this is where you see a little more change. I'm going to look at the states first that are pretty solidly showing Trump in the lead. Again, I will point out that these polls can be a little fluid at times, but nonetheless, Trump is really favored in about 4 of those 7 states. Arizona, up by about 4.1 percentage points. Georgia, up by about 4 percentage points. North Carolina, Trump up by about 5 percentage points. And Nevada, Trump up by about 5.3 percentage points. So those states seem to be going toward Trump, at least right now in this contest where we're about 6 months or so out. There's 3 other states, however, that are pretty close, and those are Pennsylvania, where Trump is currently up by about 2.3 percentage points, clearly in the margin of error. Michigan, where Trump is up by 1.1 percentage points. In Wisconsin, where Trump is only up right now in this Real Clear Politics average by about 0.1 percentage points. Now, if you really add up all of these states, it would be the case that Trump would have to win those 4 that I named earlier: Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and Nevada. And he would have to win at least one of Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania to capture enough electoral college votes to win. So that's why this is going to be razor thin. Now, there are some other possible ways that Trump could win without winning one of those 3, I want to admit. There's the possibility that if he won the other 4 and won New Hampshire, which may or may not be plausible, but it could be, he could still win. And he could also get to a tie in the Electoral College if he were able to turn a few districts in Nebraska or Maine where the counts don't go totally toward the winner in the state. There's sort of a hybrid role here. But again, I don't see that really happening, that Nebraska and Maine possibility, winning everything in Nebraska and at least one in Maine. I don't necessarily see that happening. It could. I don't necessarily see him winning New Hampshire, just given where polls are now. So in my mind, that would mean that Trump would have to win one of Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania. And again, at 0.1 up to 2.3 in the spread in the polls in those 3 states, we know that they are very, very close. And really, in many ways, the presidential race hinges on those states. So that's just a quick recap of where we are in the electoral college vote and in the popular vote. In the case of if somehow you did come to a 269 to 269 tie, technically the election goes to the House of Representatives, and each state gets to cast one vote for president. And so, therefore, who controls the House delegations would dictate who actually would win the presidency in that case. Well, right now, the Republicans control the House delegations 26 to 22 with two split. But again, you could see that that is very, very close, and that count could actually change in the election as well. So the House in a tie electoral college would decide the president, and the Senate would decide the vice president. So again, overall, very, very close. The presidential race probably hinges on President Trump winning one of those three states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But the election is by no means over. We have much, much ways to go, but it does look very, very close right now. A big wild card in the presidential race is the recent conviction of Donald Trump in a New York court on fraud charges. Republicans argue that this is a big witch hunt and it was politically motivated. However, it does appear that there is some vulnerability for Donald Trump during the election because of the recent conviction. About 1 in 10 in a recent poll of Republicans said they would be less likely to vote for Trump due to the conviction. And among independents, about 25% that said they were less likely to vote for him due to the conviction. So we could begin to see polls change in the near future. In fact, there is some evidence that there's a little bit of change going on already. Let's move on to the Senate. And this is where the Senate theoretically looks pretty good for Republicans. Right now, as you may know, there is a 50-50 split in the Senate because the Democrats, with two independents voting with them, and the Republicans are equally split at 50-50. The Democrats control the chamber because the Vice President of the United States can sit as the President of the Senate and cast a tie-breaking vote. And in this case, she did so in favor of the Democrats, of course. And therefore, technically, the Senate is controlled by the Democrats with that tie-breaking vote from the vice president. The latest polls would suggest that Republicans have a very good chance of winning or keeping 49 seats. There are far more Democrats up for re-election in 2024 than Republicans. So it looks really good or very good that the Republicans will win 49 seats. That means they only need to win 2 seats to have absolute control of the Senate, or 1 seat if, for whatever reason, Donald Trump and his vice president became president. The vice president would cast the vote in favor of the Republicans, like Kamala Harris did in the current Senate for Democrats. So 49, pretty good or very good chance for the Republicans of keeping or winning 49 seats. The Democrats look very good for 42 seats. So in essence, they would have to win 9 seats to control, or 8 seats, and have the presidency again go to Democrats. So the real clear politics polling averages say there are sort of 9 toss-ups out there. And the Democrats would have to win 8 or 9 to have any chance of controlling the Senate. Within those 9 toss-up states is Senator Ted Cruz in Texas. I just don't buy, frankly, that race is really a toss-up. I know the race will be somewhat close, but I believe Ted Cruz will ultimately win Texas. So to me, that really gives the GOP 50 votes, needing just 1 more. So again, if a Republican wins the presidency, the Republicans would control the chamber. But to truly assure control, the Republicans need to win one of what I believe are really true toss-up states. The problem for Democrats is all of those 8 toss-up states, if you remove Texas and Ted Cruz, have Democratic incumbents today. Some of them are running for re-election. Others are open Democratic seats. And thus, again, the Democrats cannot lose any of those if they can even get to a 50-50 split and hope that the White House stays Democratic. Some of these 8 Democratic seats are in red states, which will be very competitive for the Republicans. Ohio and Montana are good examples. Or those 8 seats are in states that look to be going or could go Trump's way this year. Nevada, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So that sort of hurts Democrats in terms of winning across the board those 8 seats. In Maryland, I would note that popular former GOP governor Larry Hogan could win there in a very deep blue state. He's a moderate. He was very popular as governor. So there's a possibility that Larry Hogan could win in that deep blue open state of Maryland. So in essence, everything would have to go right for Democrats in the Senate races, and the White House would have to stay Democrat for them to win the upper chamber. But I will tell you here, there is certainly an outside chance, a possibility, let's say, that the incumbent Democrats are rather formidable in that the GOP actually is hurt a little in the races by some very far-right primary winners in some of these toss-up states. So again, it's not probable that the Democrats will sweep all 8 states, but it's certainly not out of the question. So clearly the Senate, in my mind, looks pretty favorable for Republicans. But again, I don't rule anything out in the Senate. The Democrats have an outside chance that they could sweep those 8 seats. Let's get over to the House. And this is what I would call more of a crapshoot. And so political gerrymandering, named for a 19th century governor of Massachusetts, Eldridge Gerry, has made most congressional districts solidly blue or red. Right around about 90% of all House seats are safe or likely holds for either party. So there's not a lot of competition in the House the way these lines are gerrymandered and drawn by state legislatures. It leaves just about 50 seats or so that are even in play in this year's election. There's something called the generic ballot, which seeks to ascertain whether, generally speaking, voters are favoring the GOP or the Democrats in a given election. Well, right now, the generic ballot tends to be going back and forth, slightly favoring either party over the other one in the past several weeks. And sometimes the GOP is favored by 0.2 percentage points. Sometimes the Democrats are favored by about 0.2 percentage points. What this again shows is that the race for Congress is very, very tight. This generic ballot is within the margin of error, so it's extremely close. Looking at a number of House reviews and political pundits and pollsters out there, I sort of came up with my view that Republicans appear to have about 210 or 211 seats that are safe, likely, or lean Republican. Democrats appear to have between 202 to 207 seats that are safe, likely, or lean Democrat. That leaves just 17 to 23 seats that are highly contested toss-ups in my mind. Republicans would need to win a third to half of the toss-up races to win control of the chamber. So that probably favors Republicans. Democrats would need to win between 1/2 and all of the seats, depending on what ones really seem to be open to win control of the chamber. So that goes against a little bit of the Democrats winning the chamber back from the GOP. So Democrats' numbers look a little bad, But many of the toss-ups are in deep blue states. Some of them, too, are in the close presidential states where shifting polls could impact congressional districts. So in my mind, this still makes who controls the House chamber much closer than you would think. And I also want you to remember that the GOP underperformed demonstrably in 2022. So with that, I am going to have us take our first break, and we will be back in 1 minute.
The Healthcare Labyrinth is no ordinary website. It features news and commentary from one of the nation's leading healthcare policy and technology experts. Marc Ryan combs the internet for the latest healthcare news and publishes a news feed each weekday with summations and Marc's insights. Twice a week, Marc publishes a blog to go deep into a current issue. And of course, Marc hosts a podcast each week to delve even further. All of this is available at healthcarelabyrinth.com. Visit each day for the latest happenings in healthcare. As well, learn more about Marc's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at the website. That's healthcarelabyrinth.com, your go-to source for healthcare news.
Welcome back. We hope you're enjoying my analysis of what could happen in the 2024 election. Just to recap, the election is close once again, at least for the presidency and the House races. The Senate might be a little more favorable to Republicans. House control, again, could come down to a set of swing districts. The presidential race could come down to a few dozen counties in a small number of states. I think it's Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. As I have maintained, that is where healthcare issues could come in to impact results. Many of the voters in these swing districts or counties may be philosophically disposed to choose a candidate that espouses their views on healthcare. While the economy and immigration seem to take importance in national polls and healthcare is a little lower, it may be the case in some of these swing districts or areas which tend to be a little more moderate that healthcare issues, again, could play a sleeper role. And I would also note that in many cases today, healthcare is a bit of a subset of economic issues. Healthcare is hard to pay for. It increases in costs every year. And so it's always on people's mind as part of the family budget and the family economy. So that's why I think in these swing areas in the House and the president, healthcare and the views of the candidates on healthcare could play a role. And in comes the latest Kaiser Family Foundation tracking poll, which I talked about in earlier blogs and podcasts, to show how the American public really views much about healthcare very favorably. And they want to see wide coverage, and they want to take care of people. It's as simple as that. And this seems to be despite, for the most part, not in every case, despite party affiliation. So on an ongoing basis, the Kaiser Family Foundation does this tracking poll, and it asks American voters what their views are on these critical healthcare issues. And things are pretty status quo. They haven't changed that dramatically since the last tracking poll, but we are getting closer to the election. And I wanted to share a little of some of that KFF tracking poll results with all of you to show you why healthcare issues could play that sleeper role, and why that voters are really pretty moderate and very open-minded and compassionate on healthcare issues. In general, in this KFF tracking poll, President Biden is trusted more on healthcare issues than former President Trump. Here are some important general results on who is trusted more. So when potential voters were asked who was better to determine the future of the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, the respondents said that Biden was better 45% and Trump was better 33%. When asked who was better to maintain protections for people with pre-existing health conditions, part of the Affordable Care Act, Biden was presumed better by 45% of people and Trump by 33% of people. When asked who was better to ensure access to affordable health insurance, Biden won 43% and Trump 32%. Who was better to determine the future of Medicaid? Biden at 42%, Trump at 33%. Who was better to determine the future of Medicare? Biden was at 41%, Trump was at 33%. Who was better to address high healthcare costs? This is where perhaps an economic issue comes in, which is at the top of the list compared to healthcare and election issues. And it was much closer here. Biden was at 38% and Trump at 36%. What's notable is that independent voters, which you could call being many of those swing voters, especially in these swing states and districts and counties, Biden was trusted more than the percentages above that I just read off in all categories. So that really says something, that independent voters really trust Biden more on these healthcare issues, even the most important high healthcare cost one that we just talked about. So it's very, very interesting. And again, it seemed pretty clear that Biden was trusted more to govern healthcare issues overall. Next, the Kaiser Family Foundation tracking poll asked about what knowledge was of the Inflation Reduction Act's Medicare drug price law, and whether parties wanted to see an extension, and what their views were on certain aspects of that Medicare drug price law. Now, I've always said that voters clearly want to see drug price negotiations and want to see caps on overall drug costs. And the Kaiser Family Foundation poll seems to back this up. So when asked what were their views on capping monthly out-of-pocket costs for insulin for all adults with health insurance, not just Medicare, which caps for insulin are in place now for, 86% of all voters said they would want to see caps on insulin for all adults with health insurance, regardless of whether it was Medicare or commercial insurance. When asked their views on placing a limit on out-of-pocket prescription drug costs for all adults with health insurance, remember that the Inflation Reduction Act caps out-of-pocket costs in Medicare Part D at $2,000 a year. 84% of all voters wanted to see limits in even commercial coverage. When asked whether the Medicare drug price negotiation law should be expanded by increasing the number of drugs subject to price negotiation, I found this absolutely interesting. 75% of all voters responding to the poll said that. 79% of Democrats said it. 80% of independents said it. And even 68% of Republicans said it. So the Medicare drug price negotiation law is clearly very, very popular. And Republicans, in a majority sense, really do support it as well. And what's interesting is in terms of policy, President Biden and President Trump are probably not that different. I've made the case in blogs and podcasts before that this is where they may see more eye to eye on healthcare as opposed to other areas. Obviously, President Biden championed the passage of the Medicare drug price law. But if we go back to Trump's administration, he did also want to introduce what's known as international reference pricing to control Part B drugs. He actually made proposals on that, but also mentioned that he would like to extend it to Part D drugs. Now, the Medicare drug price negotiation law isn't exactly international reference pricing, but they are very, very similar. For whatever reason, the president has not highlighted his views on Medicare drug price. He has come out and mentioned that he'd like to control prices, but very clearly, this is sort of seen as President Biden's area of activity. And I think voters across parties are giving him much greater credit on the issue of drug price negotiation than former President Trump. The next area that the Kaiser Family Foundation tracking poll looked at was the public's views on entitlements. And in this case, we really are looking at Medicare, Medicaid, and the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. And so in the first case of Medicare, they sort of broke this out into very favorable, somewhat favorable, and then somewhat unfavorable and unfavorable. So I'm really looking at the very favorable and somewhat favorable as sort of positive views of the programs. So in Medicare, across all of the respondents, Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, 41% viewed Medicare very favorably and 39% somewhat favorably. So we're talking about 80% of support for Medicare here. In the case of Medicaid, across all Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, 32% of all voters viewed it very favorably and 43% somewhat favorably. So here we still have about 75% or 3/4 of the respondents across all parties having favorable views of Medicaid. I think that's very interesting because, as we know, while both parties are pretty strong supporters of Medicare, in the case of Medicaid, Republicans in Congress have sought to take an axe to the program by block granting it and things like that, whereas Democrats have been very favorable. But of all voters, somewhere around 75% or 3/4 view Medicaid very favorably. When they were asked whether Medicaid should largely continue as it is today, 70% of all voters said it should continue largely as it is today, with 87% of Democrats, 74% of Independents, and this is where we see a little bit of difference. Just 50% of Republicans said it should continue largely as it is today. But still, half of Republicans think it should continue the way it is, and certainly an overwhelming number, 3/4 of Independents roughly think it should continue that way. Going to the Affordable Care Act, voters were also asked, respondents were asked, what is your view about the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare? 29% viewed it very favorably and 31% somewhat favorably. So somewhere about 60% of all respondents viewed it favorable in general. This is where we also saw some differences with GOP voters. Only about 1/3 of GOP voters hold favorable views on the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. However, I would argue, again, that 1/3 of GOP voters, that's pretty significant given the bashing Obamacare has taken by President Trump and leading congressional leaders. So that's still, to me, pretty significant. Next, people were asked about changes to the Affordable Care Act, and there were sort of mixed views here. This is where we saw a little more difference among party affiliation. When asked about extending financial assistance for people who purchase health coverage through the Affordable Care Act marketplace, this is the extension of the enhanced premium subsidies. 90% of Democrats favored it, 74% of Independents, and 57% of Republicans. So a majority of Republicans still, though, do want to see enhanced financial assistance extended. On repealing and replacing the ACA, only 24% of Democrats said they wanted to see that, 51% of Independents. And again, over here, given what Republicans said about favorability, about 76% of Republicans wanted to see a repeal and replace strategy. So that is sort of a quick look at the KFF poll. We're going to come back after this last break here to sort of sum up some of what we heard in the poll and then to just conclude today's podcast.
Health plans and insurance are confusing. Our healthcare system is in dire need of reform. Health policy expert Marc Ryan tackles both issues in his book, The Healthcare Labyrinth. It is both a guide to navigating health plans and fixing American health insurance. Marc dives deep into how health plans and the American health insurance system operate. He then outlines a comprehensive reform agenda for the system as a whole, including pricing, emphasizing health and care management, and ensuring affordable access to health coverage and a private delivery model. Marc is a bit of an unconventional Republican in that he believes affordable access is the morally right thing to do, and that it is also fiscally prudent for our nation. Learn more about Marc's book, The Healthcare Labyrinth, at healthcarelabyrinth.com or search at leading bookseller websites. Available in print, ebook, and audiobook forms.
Welcome back, and we hope you're enjoying this edition of the Healthcare Labyrinth podcast. We've sort of gone through the status of the 2024 elections for the presidency, the House, and the Senate prospects. We went through the Kaiser Family Foundation poll, and we're now going to sort of conclude here. So just very quickly, in general, it's my view, based on what the poll said, was that the American public, really regardless of party affiliation, support healthcare entitlements and drug price reform too. And they seem to give the bow to Biden as the best healthcare overseer here versus Trump. There are some differences when we look a little bit into the favorability of the ACA, between parties, and also about repealing and replacing, but just generally overall, all party affiliations tend to support healthcare reform, drug price reform, and they seem to give Biden the edge. And this is where I think this could certainly play a role in the election. The candidates understand the significance of healthcare issues, I believe, or at least I hope they do. Biden recently went on the attack on healthcare issues because he clearly sees it as something that favors him. And he is out there clearly articulating his accomplishments and is arguing that former President Trump will significantly pare back coverage throughout the healthcare system. And I think, that's a wise move by Biden. Whether Trump could actually pare it back is really dependent on whether both houses of Congress are in Republican hands, as an example. And even then, he may not have great success doing it. But nonetheless, Biden is arguing from a political sense that those are the risks. And what President Trump tends to say on healthcare on the trail, although parts are potentially positive, is it's rather truthful what Biden is saying there. And Democrats and Biden are currently running healthcare ads in swing House districts as well as in Senate states, in presidential swing states. So they probably will have some impact in these more moderate swing states and districts out there. I would also note that Trump has made some misstatements on Medicare and Social Security, and that has pretty much hurt him. While I don't believe he meant to really indicate that he wanted to go after Medicare and Social Security, I think some of his statements seemed to say that, and he quickly tried to calm the storm and backtrack by clarifying what he said. But that certainly hurts him as well. So in the end, we're sort of sitting in a very tight election because America is deeply divided along philosophical and partisan grounds. There's no question about it. This is probably the most partisan and divided we've ever seen in American politics, at least in the recent past. We are months still away from the election, so anything can happen. And we don't know exactly if healthcare will resonate with voters and if it impacts votes. But certainly based on the Kaiser Family Foundation's tracking polls, there's a decent chance that healthcare issues could become part of decision-making in some of these swing counties, districts, states, and certainly it could influence the outcome of the election. With that, we'll conclude this edition of Healthcare Labyrinth Podcast, and we'll see you next time. Take care.
Thanks for joining Marc and the Healthcare Labyrinth Podcast. Go to healthcarelabyrinth.com each day for the latest healthcare news. See you next week on the next Healthcare Labyrinth Podcast.